You're listening to What to Listen To, the podcast that answers the question you didn't even know you were asking. From fascinating deep dives to thought-provoking trends, we've got your ears covered, so sit back, plug in, and let's explore what's worth your time today.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You know how this works? We take a stack of sources and try to pull out the most interesting stuff. Well, today we're going back to 1976 for America's Bicentennial.
Ah, the Bicentennial.
You probably picture parades and fireworks.
Yeah, lots of those.
But on this deep dive, we're going to uncover the surprising and often overlooked parts of this huge celebration.
It's interesting how the Bicentennial wasn't just a party. It was more like a mirror reflecting a nation struggling with its identity, its past, and its future.
Yeah, it wasn't just all good vibes. We're talking political drama, social tension, and even environmental concerns all happening under the surface of all the red, white, and blue.
Let's start with something we can all relate to. Money companies went crazy with Bicentennial branding. We're talking everything.
Yeah.
You could think of cereal boxes, toilet paper. It all had a special Bicentennial label.
Wow, I can just imagine. It's wild how even back then companies were so good at using big events for marketing.
Well, this whole Bicentennial branding thing caused a big debate. Was it patriotic or just companies trying to make a quick buck? Think about it. We see the same thing today with events like the Olympics or even national holidays. Where does celebrating end and taking advantage begin? It's a question we're still trying to answer.
Right, like is buying a Bicentennial burger really showing your patriotism, or are you just falling for a clever marketing trick?
Could be both, I guess.
Probably. But there was also some serious political stuff going on behind the scenes. The planning for this big Bicentennial bash was a mess. Seriously, it got so bad they had to disband the original convention to get a new one.
Oh, wow. There were all these accusations of mismanagement, corruption, and no clear direction. I mean, think about it. An event meant to celebrate unity was falling apart because of infighting. It's like those fights mirrored all the political divisions in the country back then.
It makes you wonder if anyone was even in the mood to party. This was just a few years after Watergate. The country was still dealing with that whole scandal. It must put a damper on things.
Definitely, Watergate really hurt people's trust in the government. It made the Bicentennial a lot more complicated. Did people really want to celebrate, or were they just trying to pretend everything was okay? Imagine trying to have a big party when everyone's questioning the people in charge. Pretty awkward, right?
Yeah, like, hey, let's have a party, but can we also talk about all the problems we're having? And speaking of problems, the Bicentennial wasn't all happy parades. There were protests, too.
Oh, yeah. For a lot of people, the Bicentennial was a chance to point out their struggles and demand change. For example, Native American activists said that 200 years for America meant centuries of oppression for them. They disrupted events like the Tall Ships Parade in New York Harbor to make their voices heard.
Wow, disrupting a parade. That's a powerful statement. It shows how much they wanted to use the Bicentennial to get people's attention. It's a good reminder that big celebrations often ignore the real problems people are facing.
Right. And it wasn't just Native Americans. African American communities and Vietnam War veterans also used the Bicentennial to talk about things like racism and the difficulties soldiers faced coming home from war.
So the Bicentennial was a chance for everyone to tell their own story, not just the official one.
Right.
Exactly. It shows how different people can have very different views of history. What some people celebrate, others might protest. The Bicentennial is a great example of how a country tries to remember and deal with its past.
Okay, here's a story that really highlights those different views. The American Freedom Train. It was supposed to be this amazing traveling museum. It was going to take important artifacts all over the country and share a message of unity.
Sounds like a great idea in theory.
Yeah, but there was a big problem.
What happened? Did the train break down?
Worse, the Freedom Train skipped over a bunch of cities, especially cities with a lot of minorities. People started saying that the train was avoiding communities of color on purpose. They said it was discrimination, and the whole project meant to unify the country ended up showing how divided it really was. Wow, what a mess. It shows how good intentions can go wrong, especially when you're dealing with a complicated and often painful history.
Yeah. It's like trying to bake a cake and only putting icing on half of it.
That's a great analogy. And this wasn't just a simple mistake. It started a national conversation about whose stories get told, whose history matters, and who gets to be part of the American story. It made people ask uncomfortable questions about what it really means to be American.
It makes you think about who we choose to celebrate and who we often leave out of the story. Speaking of things not going as planned, let's talk about the environment. I wouldn't think a party, even a big one, could hurt the planet that much.
You'd be surprised. All those celebrations, the fireworks, the crowds, and all the stuff they made for the bicentennial, it all left a mark on the environment. I'm talking pollution litter and damage to nature. Some people said it was ironic to celebrate America's beauty while also trashing it.
It's like throwing a huge party at your house and then realizing you have to clean up the mess. Except in this case, the house is the whole country.
That's a good way to put it. And it's similar to what we're talking about today with big events like concerts and sports games. Can we celebrate without destroying the planet? It's a question we're still trying to figure out.
Okay, let's move on to something else. We've talked about the stuff that went wrong. But there were also a lot of ambitious plans. Big projects that people dreamed up but never actually happened. I'm talking monuments, museums, whole exhibitions meant to show off America's achievements. What happened to those?
A lot of those projects ran into problems. They didn't have enough money, they got stuck in bureaucracy, or people just weren't that interested. Think about the National Bicentennial Exposition that was supposed to be in Philadelphia. Imagine a futuristic World's Fair showing off American innovation and progress, all happening in the city where America was born. It sounds incredible, right?
Yeah, it does. Like flying cars and robots serving hot dogs and apple pie. What went wrong?
Reality got in the way. The project had money problems, political fights, and even worries about how it would affect the people who lived there. In the end, it was just too ambitious. It's a reminder that even the biggest dreams can get crushed by real-life problems.
I guess it's like when I was a kid and I tried to build a giant tree house.
Yeah.
I had these big plans, but it ended up being a wobbly platform with a few splinters.
Maybe. But on a much bigger scale, of course, these unfinished projects show us what America was hoping for and what it was afraid of back then. They were ambitious, sometimes even crazy, but they showed that people wanted to do something truly amazing to celebrate this big anniversary.
So what's the big takeaway from all of this?
It seems like the bicentennial was full of big plans that never really took off. It makes you wonder if, while America was focused on itself, it missed some important things happening in the rest of the world. But before we look at the bigger picture, I think there's one more dream deferred we should talk about. Remember the wagon train pilgrimage?
Oh yeah, the one where people reenacted the pioneer journeys across the country? I remember seeing pictures of those covered wagons arriving at Valley Forge. It looked like something out of a history book.
Exactly. It was meant to capture that spirit, the pioneers heading west, facing hardship with grit and determination. You can practically hear the banjo music.
It's such a classic American image.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what made people want to do something like that. I mean, it couldn't have been easy to travel across the country in a covered wagon.
Yeah. Why do you think they did it? Was it just nostalgia, a desire to connect with the past? Or maybe they wanted simpler times, even if it was just a romanticized version of history?
Probably a bit of everything. It definitely caught people's attention. Thousands participated and millions followed their journey in the news. It was like a real-life reality show, but with horses and wagons instead of fancy cars and designer clothes.
That's a great way to put it. A reality show on a national stage. And just like any good reality show, there was drama. The pilgrimage got criticized too. Some people said it was too sentimental and ignored the bad parts of westward expansion.
Oh yeah, like forgetting about how Native Americans were treated. It's like watching a Western movie and cheering for the cowboys without thinking about the people whose land they were taking.
Exactly. The wagon train pilgrimage, like many other parts of the bicentennial, made people think about how we see history and whose stories are told. It reminds us to look beyond the romanticized version of the past and acknowledge the difficult and unfair parts that are often hidden.
I'm noticing a pattern here. Even the celebratory parts of the bicentennial had this underlying tension. These questions about who is included in the American story and how we deal with the parts of our history that aren't so great.
You're right. And that tension is something we're still dealing with today.
But let's shift gears a bit. Remember how we were talking about how America might have missed some important things happening globally because it was so focused on itself?
Yeah, like being so busy planning a birthday party that you forget to check your mail and miss an important bill. Exactly. While America was celebrating its bicentennial, there were problems brewing in the world. Just a few years later, the Iran hostage crisis would happen and shake America's sense of security. Some people say that because America was so focused on celebrating itself, it didn't pay attention to what was happening in the rest of the world.
So America was too busy looking in the mirror and didn't notice the storm clouds on the horizon.
Precisely. And this brings up some important questions for us. How do we celebrate our achievements while also paying attention to what's happening in the world? Can a country focus too much on itself and miss important things happening outside?
Those are some tough questions. It's like that saying, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't be completely focused on yourself and on the world at the same time. There has to be a balance.
You got it. Finding that balance is something America is still working on, and the Bicentennial, with its good and bad parts, gives us some valuable lessons about how to handle our place in an increasingly connected world.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot. We've talked about the controversies, the protests, the impact on the environment, the dreams that didn't come true, and even what was happening in the rest of the world. It's been quite a journey.
It has. But our look at the 1976 Bicentennial isn't over yet. We still need to talk about its legacy. How did this event change America's identity? What lasting impacts did it have, both symbolic and real? And most importantly, what lessons can we learn from it today as we get closer to another big anniversary, the 250th anniversary of the United States?
I'm ready to dive into those questions.
Yeah.
It seems like every generation has to figure out what it means to be American, and the Bicentennial was a big part of that conversation.
All right, we've explored the good, the bad, the exciting, and the disappointing parts of the 1976 Bicentennial. But now I'm thinking about what it left behind. Did it really change anything, or was it just a big party that everyone forgot about?
That's a good question. And I don't think there's a simple answer. The Bicentennial didn't leave behind any giant monuments or anything, but it did have a lasting impact in some ways, both big and small. Okay, so what kind of impact are we talking about? Give me some examples.
Well, one important result was the creation of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those. They give money to all kinds of cultural and educational projects, right? I had no idea. They came from the Bicentennial.
Yep, that's right. They were created because people started to realize how important art and culture are to American society. And that focus is still making a difference today. These organizations have funded tons of projects, from museum exhibits to writing festivals. They're helping people be creative and learn all over the country.
That's really cool. It's like a positive ripple effect from all that Bicentennial excitement. But what about the less obvious stuff? How did the Bicentennial change the way Americans thought about themselves and their country?
That's where things get really interesting. I think the Bicentennial made Americans really think about their identity. It wasn't just about celebrating the past 200 years. It was about figuring out what it meant to be American in a time when things were changing fast and there was a lot of uncertainty. Remember, this was just after the Vietnam War and Watergate. People were feeling disillusioned. They needed to figure out what America really stood for.
So it was like a national therapy session, a chance to work through some tough stuff and decide what to do next.
Exactly. The Bicentennial forced America to look at its good and bad sides, its successes and failures. It started conversations about race equality, the government, and freedom. These weren't easy conversations, but they were important for a country trying to find its way in a changing world.
It sounds like the Bicentennial was a turning point, a time for both celebrating and figuring things out. It makes me wonder how people see it today, almost 50 years later. Is it seen as a success, a failure, or somewhere in between?
That's something historians and cultural experts are still debating. Our views of history are always changing depending on what's happening now and our own experiences. Something that seemed like a huge success in 1976 might look different today.
It's like looking back at old pictures of yourself from high school. You might laugh at your clothes or hair, but you also feel nostalgic and realize how much you've changed.
Exactly. And just like with those old photos, there's value in looking back at the Bicentennial. Not just for the memories, but to understand how it shaped who we are today. What parts of it still matter to us? What can we learn from what went right and what went wrong? And how can we use those lessons as we get closer to the 250th anniversary?
That's a good point. It's not just about looking back. It's about using the past to help us now and in the future. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the 1976 Bicentennial, what are the main things we should remember? What do you hope our listeners take away from this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that history is never simple or straightforward. The Bicentennial was complicated and messy, full of different perspectives and stories. It was a time for celebrating, but also for protesting and disagreeing. It was a time for being proud of America, but also for admitting its mistakes. And that's okay. Accepting that complexity is what makes history so interesting and important to us today.
I couldn't agree more. The 1976 Bicentennial wasn't just a party. It showed us the hopes, fears, and complexities of a country going through big changes. And as we get closer to the 250th anniversary, it's good to remember this time. Not just to celebrate how far we've come, but to think about the work we still need to do to make America a better place. And for our listeners, we hope this deep dive has made you curious about the Bicentennial and how it still affects us. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep digging deeper into history.
And most importantly, as you get ready for the 250th anniversary celebrations, remember that history isn't just something you read about in books. It's something we all create and take part in. Use this upcoming anniversary as a chance to connect with your community, learn from the past, and contribute to the story of America.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this trip back to 1976. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those deep dives going. So we've talked about all the good and bad and everything in between about the 1976 Bicentennial. But what about after the party was over? Did anything really change? Did the Bicentennial leave a lasting mark on America?
That's the question, isn't it? I think it's complicated. The Bicentennial didn't exactly lead to any huge changes or big monuments being built, but it did have a lasting effect in some ways.
Okay, I'm curious. What kind of effects?
Well, for one thing, it led to the creation of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts.
Oh, right. I know those names. They give money to support all kinds of cultural and educational projects.
Right.
I never realized they came out of the Bicentennial.
Yep, that's right. Their creation shows how people started to value art and culture more in American society. And those organizations are still having a positive impact today. They've given money to all sorts of projects like museum exhibitions and literary festivals. They're helping people all over the country to be creative and learn new things.
That's pretty awesome. It's like the Bicentennial's good energy kept on going.
Uh-huh.
But what about the stuff that's harder to see? How did the Bicentennial change how Americans saw themselves in their country?
That's where things get really interesting. The Bicentennial kind of forced America to have a conversation about its identity. It wasn't just about celebrating the past 200 years. It was also about trying to figure out what it meant to be American during a time of a lot of change and uncertainty. Remember, this was right after the Vietnam War and Watergate. So there was this feeling of disappointment and a need to figure out what America really stood for.
So there was like a time for America to look in the mirror and think about who it was and who it wanted to be.
Exactly. The Bicentennial forced America to look at its good and bad parts, its successes and its failures. It started important conversations about things like race equality, the role of the government, and what freedom really means. And even though those conversations weren't always easy, they were important for a country that was trying to figure out its place in a world that was changing quickly.
It sounds like the Bicentennial was more than just a celebration. It was a time for both looking back and looking ahead. It makes you wonder how people see it today, almost 50 years later. Do people think it was a success or a failure?
That's a good question. And honestly, I think historians are still debating that. Our views of history change all the time depending on what's happening in the world and what we're going through personally. Something that seemed like a huge success in 1976 might look different to us now.
It's like looking back at old photos of yourself. You might laugh at what you were wearing or how you had your hair, but it also makes you think about how much you've changed since then.
Exactly. And just like those old photos, it's worth looking back at the Bicentennial, not just for fun, but to see how it shaped who we are today. What parts of it still matter to us? What can we learn from the things that went well and the things that didn't go so well? And how can we use those lessons as we get ready for the 250th anniversary?
That's a great point. It's not just about remembering the past. It's about using the past to help us now and in the future. So as we finish up our deep dive into the 1976 Bicentennial, what are the most important things for us to remember? What do you hope our listeners will take away from this?
I think the main thing to remember is that history is never simple. The Bicentennial was complicated and messy with lots of different perspectives and stories. It was a time for celebrating, but also for disagreeing and protesting. It was a time for being proud of America, but also for admitting its mistakes. And that's okay. Accepting that complexity is what makes history so interesting and so relevant to our lives.
I totally agree. The 1976 Bicentennial was so much more than just a party. It was a reflection of the hopes, fears, and complexities of a country that was changing and growing. As we get ready for the 250th anniversary, it's a good time to look back at that time. Not just to celebrate how far we've come, but also to remember the work we still need to do to make America a better place for everyone. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has made you curious about the Bicentennial and its impact. We encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep exploring history.
And don't forget, as we get closer to the 250th anniversary, history isn't just something we read about, it's something we are all a part of creating. Use this anniversary as a chance to connect with your community, to learn from the past, and to help shape the future of America.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this trip back to 1976. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Until next time, don't just hear the world, listen to it.